The story of the Mark Hopkins Mansion begins long before the first stone was laid on the crest of San Francisco's Nob Hill. To understand how this mansion came to exist, and why it would eventually become one of the most talked-about residences of the Gilded Age, we have to trace the life of the man whose name it carried. We will explore the origins of Mark Hopkins, his rise during one of the most dramatic economic transformations in American history, and the decision to build a home that would symbolize wealth, ambition, and the relentless march of progress. The complete story is not only about a house, but about a man, a city, and an era defined by expansion and desire. Mark Hopkins was born in 1813 in rural New York. Like many young men of modest means in the early 19th century, he grew up watching America push outward. The country was changing, and mobility offered new opportunities. Hopkins possessed a quiet temperament and an unusual gift for careful calculation. He would use these traits to navigate a world full of risk and speculation. When the California gold rush erupted in 1848, waves of people surged westward in hopes of striking it rich. This sudden migration fundamentally altered the scale and speed of commerce. Hopkins recognized that the gold itself was not the real opportunity. Instead, the infrastructure needed to support the movement and exploitation of natural resources would be far more valuable. This insight set him on the path that would define both his fortune and his legacy. In the early 1850s, Hopkins moved to California. He did not arrive with flashy ambition. Rather, he began quietly building relationships with others who understood the economic potential of Western expansion. Among these figures were collies P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Leland Stanford. Together, they eventually became known as the Big Four, the industrialists behind the Central Pacific Railroad. Hopkins earned his place in this powerful circle through prudence, honesty, and financial discipline. He handled accounting and purchasing for the Central Pacific, ensuring that the enormous capital expenditures required for building the Transcontinental Railroad were meticulously tracked. This cautious approach distinguished him from the reckless speculation common during the period. By the mid-1860s, the Big Four had positioned themselves at the center of one of the most transformative engineering endeavors in American history, the effort to link the Atlantic and Pacific coasts by rail. Millions of dollars, thousands of laborers, and staggering quantities of material were funneled into construction. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 fundamentally changed the United States, reducing travel time across the continent from months to days. Wealth from shipping, freight, and land speculation soon followed. The Big Four became some of the richest men in the country. Hopkins, who had lived modestly most of his life, now possessed a fortune large enough to imagine building a residence reflective of this newfound status. The hill overlooking San Francisco had become a magnet for industrial titans, merchants, and financiers. Nob Hill, as it was called, offered sweeping views of the bay and represented a symbolic pinnacle of wealth. By situating a mansion there, Hopkins would align himself with the elite class shaping California's future. In 1872, Hopkins purchased a prime plot of land on Nob Hill and began the process of planning a residence unlike anything the West Coast had seen. The mansion was conceived during a period of architectural opulence in the United States. Wealthy industrialists sought to construct grand homes that signaled influence and permanence. European architectural styles, particularly French Second Empire designs, were fashionable due to their association with aristocratic power. Hopkins hired a prominent architect, and soon detailed plans emerged reflecting extravagance. The house would be enormous, constructed of brick, stone, and iron. It would feature elaborate ornamentation, sweeping staircases, towering chimneys, and richly furnished interiors. Over the next several years, skilled craftsmen, imported materials, and extensive labor transformed the hilltop into a massive construction site. As the exterior walls rose, residents of San Francisco watched with fascination. The mansion symbolized a new Gilded Age of wealth accumulation in the West. It communicated power and permanence, but it also embodied contradictions. Hopkins was known to be careful with money, even frugal. Yet here was an extravagant palace costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, built atop a city still recovering from earlier fires and struggling with inequality. Some viewed the mansion as a triumph, others as a symbol of excess. During construction, Hopkins divided his time between managing investments and directing the details of the new residence. His wife, Mary Frances Sherwood Hopkins, was deeply involved as well. She had a strong interest in art and refinement, pushing for aesthetic flourishes intended to rival the mansions of Eastern magnates. Her taste guided choices in furniture, draperies, and imported decorations. The mansion grew not only as a dwelling, but as a monument to the aspirations of a couple rising within the uppermost ranks of American society. Railroad profits soared throughout the 1870s, reshaping trade and commerce across the Pacific coast. San Francisco became a crucial port linking Asia, Latin America, and the United States. Wealth flowed through rail connections and land speculation related to railroad expansion. The Hopkins Mansion, towering above the city, became a physical manifestation of the connections between transportation, finance, and national ambition. Yet while the structure neared completion, Hopkins' health declined. The rigors of financial management, frequent travel, and the stress of overseeing railroad operations took a toll. Despite the mansion approaching completion, he would never fully reside in it. In 1878, Mark Hopkins died aboard a train near Yuma, Arizona, while traveling back to California. His death marked the end of his personal involvement in the mansion project, but it did not end the story of the building itself. Mary Hopkins, with an inheritance surpassing millions, continued to complete the mansion. Its interior was filled with artwork, ornate furnishings, imported carpets, and luxurious fixtures. The mansion officially became one of the most elaborate private residences in the United States. Visitors reported that the scale was overwhelming, with grand parlors, towering ceilings, gilded surfaces, and lavish displays of wealth. By the late 19th century, the Hopkins Mansion was a defining feature of Nob Hill, joining similarly extravagant homes owned by other railroad magnates and industrial elites. The entire district transformed into a symbol of concentrated wealth. Servants, horse-drawn carriages, and elaborate parties coexisted with views of the bustling port and expanding city. Yet beneath the gilded veneer lay tensions. Labor disputes erupted throughout California as workers demanded fair wages and humane conditions. Anti-monopoly sentiment grew. The Central Pacific and its leaders became targets of criticism for accusations of exploitation and political manipulation. The Hopkins Mansion, from its vantage point overlooking the city, appeared either as a testament to progress or a monument to inequality depending on the viewer's perspective. These contradictions would only intensify as the 19th century drew to a close. The building stood as both accomplishment and provocation. Although the mansion appeared physically immovable, events were already unfolding that would threaten its permanence. San Francisco was a city built atop shifting ground, both literally and metaphorically. Fires, earthquakes, and rapid expansion shaped its history. While the mansion survived the immediate decades following Hopkins' death, the coming century would challenge the very foundations on which it stood. In later installments, we will explore how the Hopkins Mansion became intertwined with a new institution, how it transformed from private residence to public landmark, and how disaster eventually struck. The story of this mansion is ultimately a reflection of the ambitions and vulnerabilities of an age where fortunes could be built with unprecedented speed and lost just as rapidly. The first chapter of this saga ends with a nearly completed palace, resting defiantly atop Nob Hill, a symbol of wealth and industry. But the building's fate, and the legacy of the man whose name it carried, remained uncertain. The Mark Hopkins Mansion entered a new phase after the death of Mark Hopkins in 1878. The building was nearing completion, and the estate transferred into the hands of Mary Hopkins, who was suddenly one of the wealthiest widows in America. The mansion became not simply a residence but the expression of Mary's vision. As she oversaw the final stages of construction, she made decisions that shaped the public image and cultural significance of the building for decades. This second installment examines the completion of the mansion, Mary Hopkins, transformation into a patron of art and culture, and the emergence of Nob Hill as a social and symbolic landscape. The mansion's story reflects shifting expectations of wealth and legacy in the post-Civil War era. When construction resumed under Mary Hopkins, the residence expanded in both aesthetic ambition and financial cost. Mary believed that the mansion should rival the greatest residences of Europe, reflecting not only industrial wealth but cultivated taste. She traveled widely, gathering inspiration from continental palaces and aristocratic estates. Paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and rare furnishings were acquired, often at staggering expense. Contemporary newspaper reports described delivery wagons hauling crates marked with foreign shipping labels up the steep grades of Nob Hill. Workers carried polished marble, carved wood panels, and ornate chandeliers through the unfinished halls. The mansion's interior was engineered to display these acquisitions. Wide corridors and large reception rooms allowed guests to circulate, encounter artworks, and participate in the theater of wealth. Tall windows framed panoramic views of San Francisco Bay and the surrounding city, contrasting the interior refinement with the bustling maritime commerce below. The mansion became a microcosm of the global networks that fueled the Hopkins fortune. Imported materials, international artistic influences, and railroad capital converged within its walls. Mary commissioned conservatories filled with exotic plants, evidence of the Victorian fascination with horticulture and scientific collecting. Servant quarters, kitchens, and service corridors were designed for efficiency, reflecting the hierarchical structure of domestic labor in elite households. By the early 1880s, Mary Hopkins had completed one of the most magnificent private residences in the United States. The mansion included multiple stories, extensive grounds, and lavish interior decor. The structure combined French Second Empire design principles with American craftsmanship, creating an impression simultaneously cosmopolitan and locally rooted. Nob Hill evolved alongside the mansion. The hill became a topographical representation of class division, with wealthy railroad magnates and industrialists building residences perched above the city's working-class neighborhoods. Visitors climbing the steep streets observed horse-drawn carriages approaching elaborate entryways. Gas lamps illuminated stone facades during evening events, creating a spectacle visible from lower districts. Social gatherings inside the Hopkins Mansion reflected the ritualized etiquette of the Gilded Age. Invitations to dinner parties or receptions signaled inclusion in an exclusive circle connected to railroad power. Guests entered through grand doors, ascending staircases framed by carved wood and painted ceilings. Musicians performed in parlors decorated with imported carpets and gilded furniture. Although descriptions vary, several accounts mention art salons where guests examined paintings acquired from European schools. The mansion functioned not only as a home, but as a site of cultural display, where wealth and refinement could be performed and legitimized. Mary Hopkins' approach to spending differed sharply from Mark's cautious financial habits. Critics accused her of extravagance, noting that funds flowing from railroad profits were used to furnish private luxury rather than support public infrastructure or charity. Yet Mary cultivated a reputation for philanthropy. She donated to hospitals, cultural institutions, and educational causes, partly to counter perceptions of indulgence. These philanthropic gestures aligned with the Victorian ideal of moral responsibility among the wealthy. Still, the mansion remained an unmistakable monument to the accumulation of private capital. The contrast between the opulence of Nob Hill and the poverty in nearby neighborhoods intensified debates about economic inequality. Workers protesting railroad conditions viewed the mansion as evidence of exploitative practices. Journalists and political reformers highlighted disparities, using Nob Hill estates to illustrate systemic injustices. The mansion entered public discourse as a symbol in ongoing conflicts over labor rights, monopolies, and political corruption associated with railroad corporations. Meanwhile, Mary Hopkins' personal life grew increasingly complex. She spent long periods traveling or entertaining high-profile guests. She cultivated artistic associations and developed an interest in establishing a formal art institution. The mansion became a staging ground for intellectual and cultural projects beyond mere social entertaining. During this period, the mansion transitioned from private construction project to established household and cultural landmark. Photographers documented its exterior, producing images circulated through newspapers and exhibitions. Engravings appeared in periodicals describing San Francisco's growth and architectural marvels. The mansion's presence reinforced the narrative of California, transforming from frontier settlement to cosmopolitan center. Yet beneath the grandeur, structural vulnerabilities remained. San Francisco's geology and unpredictable climate posed risks to large masonry structures. Engineers understood the potential danger of earthquakes, but building codes and seismic research were still in early development. The mansion rested atop a hill characterized by steep gradients and unstable soil in several areas. Foundations were strengthened, but limitations in 19th century construction technology left the building exposed to natural forces that would eventually threaten its survival. The household itself required extensive staff to maintain operations. Domestic service was a major employment sector in urban America, and Nob Hill residences relied on large teams of workers. Many servants were immigrants, reflecting demographic patterns in California. They worked in kitchens, laundries, stables, and maintenance roles concealed from public view. The smooth functioning of elite life depended on these laborers, yet their experiences were rarely recorded. While Mary Hopkins continued to cement her social position, tensions surrounding labor, wealth, and urban hierarchy intensified. The mansion's prominence made it a target for criticism of railroad monopolies. Editorials referenced the Big Four as emblematic of unchecked power. Although Mark Hopkins had been known for comparatively conservative business practices, the mansion associated his legacy with the broader influence of corporate magnates whose fortunes shaped national policy. As the 19th century progressed, Mary Hopkins made decisions that altered how the mansion would be used and remembered. Among the most consequential developments was her marriage to Edward Searles in the mid-1880s. Searles, an interior designer and architect, had collaborated on the mansion's decoration. Their relationship transformed into marriage, sparking controversy and litigation. Mary's adopted son contested the will, accusing Searles of manipulative influence. The dispute drew national attention. The mansion, already a symbol of wealth, now became entangled in legal battles over inheritance, reinforcing public fascination with the lives of the elite. After Mary Hopkins' death in 1891, Searles inherited substantial wealth and control over the estate. The legal proceedings and media attention underscored themes of greed and contested legacy. During this tumult, the mansion's future became uncertain. Searles rarely resided in the house, and maintenance demands grew. A building designed for opulent gatherings became quiet, its halls largely empty. The mansion stood intact, but the original purpose and social life within had faded. Meanwhile, San Francisco expanded rapidly. Population growth, industrial development, and immigration changed the city's character. New buildings rose around Nob Hill, and infrastructure improvements altered the landscape. Cable cars linked the hill more directly with commercial areas. Hotels and clubs appeared, indicating shifting patterns of urban leisure. The Hopkins Mansion, though still standing, no longer dominated the skyline as completely as before. Architects and urban theorists began discussing possible new uses for large dormant estates. Some argued that private mansions should be converted into public institutions or shared urban spaces. Others advocated preservation as historical artifacts. The mansion entered debates about inheritance, architectural heritage, and public versus private ownership. By the turn of the century, the building remained a fixture of the city but lacked the social vitality that had once defined it. Its ornate facade weathered ocean winds and fog. Servants maintained basic operations, but grand entertainments were infrequent. The structure waited, suspended between eras, vulnerable to forces beyond the control of architects, heirs, or critics. The next chapter in this story would begin not with social transformation or legal contest, but with a sudden catastrophe that reshaped San Francisco and altered the fate of the mansion. The calm before the disaster marked the end of an age. The Hopkins Mansion, once a monument to railroad wealth and Gilded Age ambition, stood poised to confront forces far greater than human disputes over inheritance or social prestige. In the final decade of the 19th century, when the Mark Hopkins Mansion sat silently atop Nob Hill, its stone and iron facade overlooking the restless streets below. By this time, the building no longer served as the social hub envisioned by Mary Hopkins. Instead, it had entered an ambiguous period during which its future remained unresolved. Edward Searles, Mary's widower, held legal ownership, but he rarely occupied the house. He was based primarily on the East Coast and had little desire to maintain a massive California estate that carried more sentimental association with Mary than practical use for him. The mansion continued to be staffed by a reduced domestic workforce responsible for keeping the property intact, its rooms largely unused except during periodic inspections or brief visits. Servants opened windows for ventilation, dusted furniture, checked fireplaces, and monitored structural integrity. These efforts preserved the property, but the sounds of laughter, orchestral music, and conversation from earlier decades were absent. The silence deepened the building's aura of isolation, transforming it into a quiet monument of a past era. As San Francisco entered the 20th century, economic and demographic forces accelerated urban transformation. Industrialization intensified, shipping expanded, and cable car systems improved mass transit. The urban core became denser, and new construction at the base of Nob Hill altered the skyline. Meanwhile, the Hopkins Mansion remained perched above it all, a reminder of the Gilded Age. Social critics, journalists, and political reformers used the mansion and its neighboring palaces as symbols in broader debates about inequality and the concentration of corporate power. While the Big Four had contributed to national development through railroad expansion, their fortunes had also raised questions about monopoly control, labor exploitation, and disproportionate influence over governmental policy. The mansion became shorthand for these tensions, although it now served as an empty shell rather than an active site of elite social life. In 1905, more than a quarter century after Mary's death, a new idea emerged that would give the mansion renewed purpose. A consortium of investors proposed converting the Hopkins Mansion into a luxury hotel to accommodate wealthy travelers arriving by railroad or steamship. The concept reflected a national trend. Former private estates were being repurposed as clubs, hotels, and cultural institutions. Urban development pressures, rising maintenance costs, and shifting social norms made the upkeep of private palaces impractical for individual households. At the same time, consumer demand for luxury accommodations was growing, fueled by expanding business travel and leisure tourism. The proposal involved extensive renovation of the existing structure, potentially expanding and remodeling the interior. Discussions circulated about retaining the mansion's architectural grandeur while modernizing utilities, rearranging room layouts, and adapting service systems to hotel requirements. For a brief moment, the mansion seemed poised to enter a new phase, transitioning from private residence to commercial landmark. These plans, however, would never be fully realized. On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., the city of San Francisco was jolted by a seismic event that fundamentally altered its physical and social landscape. The earthquake, estimated at magnitude 7.8, ruptured the San Andreas Fault and unleashed violent shaking across the region. Buildings collapsed, gas lines ruptured, and fires broke out, spreading rapidly through densely built urban districts. The Mark Hopkins Mansion, constructed of heavy masonry and perched atop a hill, endured the initial shaking with significant structural damage. Walls cracked, chimneys toppled, and interior fixtures shattered. But the earthquake itself did not destroy the building. The true threat came from the fires ignited throughout the city. Strong winds and ruptured infrastructure created a firestorm that overwhelmed firefighting capabilities. Flames advanced up the slopes of Nob Hill, consuming residences, commercial buildings, and public structures in their path. Workers and remaining staff at the mansion attempted to salvage property, but the scale and speed of the blaze rendered their efforts futile. Flames eventually reached the mansion, igniting wooden interior elements and consuming furnishings. The building, once filled with imported artworks, textiles, and carved wood, burned with intense heat. Contemporary accounts describe towering smoke visible for miles, with structures on Nob Hill forming a line of fire. The Mark Hopkins Mansion collapsed into smoldering ruins, reduced to rubble and charred metal framing. The conflagration, lasting for several days, destroyed most of the city's core. Nob Hill, once associated with privilege and dominance, lay in ashes. The Big Four's palaces, symbols of industrial wealth, were reduced to ruins. The destruction marked not only a physical loss but a symbolic transformation. The earthquake and fire reshaped San Francisco's identity, severing the continuity between late 19th century opulence and the uncertain reconstruction that followed. The ruins of the Hopkins Mansion stood as the remains of an era abruptly ended. In the immediate aftermath, attention focused on survival and rebuilding. Thousands were left homeless, and relief efforts mobilized to provide food, shelter, and medical care. The city government and business leaders quickly began planning reconstruction, viewing the disaster as an opportunity to modernize infrastructure, revise building codes, and reconfigure urban planning. Meanwhile, the Hopkins property presented a question: what would become of the ruins and the land beneath them? The stone retaining walls and fragments of masonry remained visible for weeks as cleanup crews worked to clear debris. Insurance disputes complicated matters. Policies often excluded damage from earthquakes, and insurers contested claims related to fires triggered indirectly by seismic events. Property owners across the city faced significant financial uncertainty regarding compensation. The estate's representatives and investors evaluated options for redevelopment. The location on Nob Hill remained desirable due to its elevation, climate, and symbolic significance, despite the devastation surrounding it. In 1907, plans emerged to build a grand hotel on the site, using the remaining footprint of the Hopkins estate. The proposal aligned with broader urban redevelopment trends in San Francisco, emphasizing modernization, hospitality infrastructure, and the promotion of tourism. The idea also capitalized on the symbolic resonance of rebuilding atop the ruins of Gilded Age wealth, transforming personal fortune into public enterprise. Construction proceeded over several years. The new hotel rose atop the same hill where the mansion once stood, signaling rebirth. The building incorporated steel frame engineering that addressed seismic risks more effectively than the mansion's heavy masonry. Architects designed the structure to withstand horizontal forces, applying lessons learned from the disaster. The transformation from mansion to hotel reflected broader socioeconomic changes. Wealth concentration remained a defining feature of early 20th century America, but its expression shifted from private palaces to commercial institutions and corporate investments. Urban elites increasingly associated prestige not with isolated estates, but with public-facing enterprises capable of generating revenue and shaping civic life. For San Francisco, rebuilding Nob Hill carried symbolic weight. Restoring the hill with new construction signaled confidence in the city's future. Roads were repaired, infrastructure upgraded, and cultural institutions supported reconstruction efforts. Yet the memory of the earthquake remained embedded in the physical and psychological landscape. The Hopkins Mansion's destruction became part of collective memory, illustrating vulnerability in the face of natural forces and the impermanence of material wealth. The mansion's fall generated reflections among residents and visitors alike. The collapse of palaces, once thought unassailable, challenged assumptions about permanence and progress. The rubble symbolized the fragility of human achievements when confronted with forces beyond technological and financial control. While many public narratives emphasized resilience and rebuilding, others acknowledged that the disaster exposed systemic weaknesses in urban planning and socioeconomic structures. Despite the total destruction of the mansion, traces of its presence lingered. Fragments of stone and iron from the original structure remained embedded in foundations or incorporated into subsequent construction. Oral histories, photographs, and records preserved glimpses of the mansion's grandeur. The memory of its rise and fall occupied a space between nostalgia and cautionary reflection. The next phase of the story involves the rise of the Mark Hopkins Hotel, built precisely where the mansion once stood. Its construction and development intersect with shifting patterns of tourism, business travel, and architectural innovation during the early 20th century. The transition from private estate to public landmark reshaped the meaning of the site and set the stage for a new chapter that linked San Francisco's past with its evolving identity. In the aftermath of the earthquake and fires of 1906, the ruins of the Mark Hopkins Mansion lingered as a stark reminder of the fragility of even the most imposing structures. Yet the site's position atop Nob Hill retained its symbolic potency. While debris was cleared and reconstruction efforts accelerated across the city, investors and civic leaders recognized the location's potential as a place for renewed activity and commerce. By 1907, momentum gathered around converting the former estate into a hotel that would embody modern engineering and reflect aspirations for a revitalized San Francisco. This fourth installment traces the development of the Mark Hopkins Hotel, the transformation of Nob Hill, and the intersections of tourism, architecture, and urban identity during the early 20th century. A consortium led by mining engineer and entrepreneur George D. Smith acquired the property and initiated plans to erect a luxury hotel on the former mansion site. Smith envisioned a building that would attract business travelers, dignitaries, and wealthy tourists arriving via transcontinental rail lines and ocean liners. The hotel would serve as both commercial enterprise and civic symbol, projecting confidence in the city's ability to rise from devastation. The Architectural Commission went to Weeks and Day, a firm known for designing large public and commercial buildings. Their proposal incorporated steel frame construction, an innovation that enhanced seismic resilience. Reinforced concrete foundations and internal supports formed a skeleton capable of resisting lateral forces generated by earthquakes. This design represented a departure from 19th century masonry practices that had contributed to widespread collapse during the 1906 disaster. The hotel rose in stages, its steel frame gradually emerging above the hill. Construction crews labored to meet engineering specifications that prioritized safety without compromising aesthetics. The structure integrated classical revival elements, including ornamental cornices, decorative balconies, and symmetrical facades that referenced European architectural traditions. Yet the underlying material logic reflected 20th century pragmatism and scientific influence. Technological systems such as electric lighting, central heating, and elevators were incorporated, placing the hotel within a new era of infrastructure sophistication. When the Mark Hopkins Hotel opened in December 1926, it immediately occupied a prominent position within the city's cultural landscape. Guests arrived through grand entryways into a lobby framed by marble columns, intricate plasterwork, and expansive windows offering panoramic views. Public rooms included dining halls, ballrooms, lounges, and reception spaces designed to host social functions, corporate events, and political gatherings. The hotel's elevation on Nob Hill gave visitors visual access to the bay, bridges, and urban core, reinforcing the association between luxury and perspective. The construction of the hotel reflected shifting socioeconomic patterns. During the Gilded Age, wealth manifested primarily through private estates. In the early 20th century, corporate capitalism expanded and diversified, prompting elites to invest in commercial ventures rather than personal palaces. Hotels like the Mark Hopkins represented this shift. They commodified luxury, making it accessible to paying guests rather than a closed social circle. This transition reflected broader cultural changes concerning class, mobility, and the democratization of leisure. The emergence of the hotel also altered the relationship between Nob Hill and the surrounding city. Previously a residential enclave of railroad magnates, the hill now attracted visitors from around the world. Cable cars delivered guests to the hotel entrance, linking public transit with elite consumption. The transformation destabilized the exclusivity associated with the hill, though it retained symbolic authority. Architectural developments on adjacent parcels reinforced Nob Hill's new identity as a hospitality district. Hotels such as the Fairmont and the Huntington were constructed or reconstructed during this period, forming a cluster of luxury accommodations that collectively shaped social geography. These institutions served as gathering places for diplomats, financiers, and cultural figures, establishing Nob Hill as a center of international exchange. The Mark Hopkins Hotel played a role in civic diplomacy. Visiting heads of state and military officers lodged there, as did artists and academics attending conferences and exhibitions. The hotel lobby became a place where business deals were negotiated, political alliances formed, and cultural performances staged. Newspapers chronicled events held within the hotel, elevating its status in public imagination. Yet the site retained traces of its earlier identity. Beneath the foundations lay the memory of the Hopkins Mansion, a material and symbolic palimpsest linking railroad wealth with modern hospitality capitalism. The shift from private estate to public hotel reflected adaptive reuse, driven by economic necessity and safety imperatives following the disaster. By the 1930s, the hotel had become fully integrated into San Francisco's social and commercial life. Maritime trade through Pacific ports expanded during this period, bringing waves of travelers and immigrant laborers. Urban planners and civic leaders promoted tourism as a strategy for economic diversification, with the hotel industry serving as a critical infrastructure component. The Mark Hopkins Hotel positioned itself as a pivot between local identity and global networks of commerce. Inside the hotel, cultural patterns evolved alongside broader social changes. Dining and entertainment spaces adapted to Prohibition-era social constraints, fostering private gatherings and speakeasy-style events concealed within ostensibly respectable establishments. After Prohibition's repeal in 1933, alcohol service resumed openly, and the hotel's bars and ballrooms regained prominence as centers of elite socialization. During World War II, the hotel took on new functions linked to military mobilization and wartime logistics. San Francisco served as a major embarkation point for troops heading to the Pacific Theater. Hotels on Nob Hill hosted officers, civilian administrators, and foreign diplomats coordinating operations. Rooms reserved for military use served as temporary lodging during transition periods. War heightened security concerns, influencing hotel administration and surveillance practices. Personnel screened guests more rigorously, and public spaces were monitored to prevent espionage or unauthorized access. The hotel thus became entangled in geopolitical networks that extended far beyond the city. Following the war, the hotel participated in post-war economic shifts characterized by consumer expansion, automobile culture, and rising disposable income. Industry leaders invested in marketing campaigns promoting San Francisco as a destination for business conventions and leisure travel. These efforts targeted middle-class tourists as well as corporate executives, expanding the demographic range of hotel patrons. Yet this expansion also introduced tensions between exclusivity and accessibility. As travel became more democratized, elite establishments faced pressure to maintain status while adapting to broader patronage. The Mark Hopkins Hotel navigated these contradictory imperatives through a dual strategy. It preserved architectural grandeur and traditional service rituals while incorporating modern amenities and diversified entertainment offerings. The development of the top of the Mark Lounge exemplified this adaptation. Located on the hotel's upper floors, the lounge offered panoramic views that attracted locals and visitors. During wartime, it became associated with romantic rituals among departing servicemen and their partners. Post-war narratives continued to emphasize the lounge's symbolic connection to the city's emotional landscape. Meanwhile, the location continued to draw scrutiny from social critics analyzing class stratification in American cities. Although Nob Hill no longer hosted private palaces of railroad tycoons, its hotels represented continuity in spatial hierarchies based on economic capital. Access to luxury hospitality remained contingent upon financial means, and the Hill remained a site where wealth displayed itself through architectural dominance. The hotel itself became an archive of personal histories, hosting events that marked transitions in individual and collective lives. Weddings, conventions, political fundraisers, and cultural performances accumulated layers of memory. Yet these experiences coexisted with an awareness of the site's vulnerability. Earthquake preparedness programs increased in the mid-20th century, with engineers conducting structural assessments and installing seismic reinforcements. These modifications acknowledged that technological advances could mitigate but not eliminate natural risk. The juxtaposition of steel frame resilience and historical memory reinforced the symbolic significance of the site. It embodied both progress and exposure. As the 20th century advanced, tourism expanded and global travel networks intensified. The Mark Hopkins Hotel, adapted through renovation and modernization projects, intended to preserve historical character while improving energy systems, safety infrastructure, and guest accommodations. Each renovation cycle reflected negotiations between heritage preservation and commercial necessity. Regulatory frameworks governing historic landmarks introduced further complexity, requiring compliance with preservation guidelines while maintaining profitable operations. The site continued to evolve, bearing witness to the transformations of San Francisco's economy, culture, and built environment. Yet beneath these developments lingered a deeper narrative concerning the legacies of industrial capital, urban geography, and historical memory. The next phase in this story involves the interplay between preservation and commodification, the hotel's role in the late 20th century tourism economy, and the persistent symbolic presence of the mansion that once occupied the Hill. By the latter half of the 20th century, the Mark Hopkins Hotel had become an established icon in San Francisco's urban landscape. Its presence atop Nob Hill was no longer novel. Instead, it represented continuity in a city characterized by flux. The underlying terrain, development pressures, and demographic transformations generated persistent instability. Yet the hotel endured, adapting to shifting cultural expectations and economic conditions. This fifth installment examines the Mark Hopkins site from the post-war period through the late 20th century, focusing on preservation, commodification, corporate ownership, and the contested meanings surrounding historical landmarks in a rapidly changing metropolis. The decades following World War II witnessed an expansive tourism industry driven by economic growth, rising consumer incomes, and advances in transportation technology. Air travel became increasingly accessible, drawing national and international visitors to San Francisco. The hotel industry faced heightened competition as new developments emerged, incorporating modern architecture and services tailored to business travelers. The Mark Hopkins Hotel responded through strategic renovation and rebranding campaigns intended to preserve its historical character while appealing to contemporary expectations. Engineers conducted structural assessments to improve seismic resilience. Reinforced steel bracing, shear walls, and upgraded mechanical systems were installed, aligned with evolving building codes and scientific understanding of earthquake risks. These modifications reflected broader societal anxieties regarding seismic safety in California metropolitan areas following destructive earthquakes in other regions. The hotel's architecture embodied a hybrid of preservation and modernization. Designers sought to maintain the building's historic facade and interior ornamentation while integrating technological upgrades, including climate control systems, automated elevators, and improved fire suppression infrastructures. These renovations balanced economic imperatives with the cultural value placed on architectural heritage. Inside the hotel, social practices shifted amid post-war transformations. Business conventions and professional conferences became central revenue sources as corporations expanded operations nationwide. Dedicated meeting rooms, ballrooms, and banquet halls hosted professional gatherings, affirming the hotel's role in facilitating commercial networks. Corporate capitalism permeated daily operations, influencing managerial decisions, marketing strategies, and labor practices. Labor unions emerged as influential actors within the hospitality sector during this period. Employees advocated for improved wages, job security, and safer working conditions. Strikes and contract negotiations periodically disrupted hotel operations, reflecting tensions between corporate expansion and frontline labor concerns. These conflicts mirrored broader political struggles over labor rights, unionization, and economic inequality in post-war America. The Mark Hopkins Hotel served as a microcosm of these dynamics, its polished public image contrasting with internal labor disputes concealed from guests. Meanwhile, the cultural image of Nob Hill continued to evolve. What had once been an enclave reserved exclusively for private wealth now functioned as a space accessible to paying customers from diverse backgrounds. Yet economic barriers still shaped participation. Access to luxury accommodations remained stratified along class lines, and the spatial elevation of Nob Hill continued to symbolize socioeconomic hierarchy. As the city diversified demographically during the mid to late 20th century, tourism marketing campaigns capitalized on San Francisco's reputation for cultural diversity, artistic innovation, and progressive politics. The Mark Hopkins Hotel leveraged these associations to enhance its appeal, promoting panoramic vistas, historical significance, and cosmopolitan experience. Advertisements projected an image of sophistication connected with urban modernity. The narrative constructed around the hotel increasingly incorporated its origins, referencing the Hopkins Mansion as part of a romanticized past. Yet these historical invocations selectively emphasized themes of resilience and transformation, while minimizing the exploitative labor conditions and monopolistic practices associated with railroad expansion. Heritage branding commodified memory for consumption within a market-driven hospitality context. During the 1960s and 1970s, the hotel intersected with cultural movements reshaping American society. San Francisco became a focal point for counterculture, civil rights activism, and political protest. Demonstrations, marches, and public gatherings occurred throughout the city, challenging institutional authority and dominant social norms. While the Mark Hopkins Hotel remained largely insulated from direct protest compared to government buildings and university campuses, its location atop Nob Hill symbolized establishment power structures. The contrast between the hotel's opulence and the socioeconomic struggles faced by marginalized communities generated visible social contradictions. In certain instances, activist groups criticized luxury institutions on Nob Hill as representations of urban inequality and exclusion. The hotel's operation during this period reflected tensions between commercial interests and emerging demands for social justice. Staff and service workers, many of whom were immigrants or members of minority communities, confronted precarious labor conditions exacerbated by corporate restructuring and intensified competition within the hospitality industry. The centralization of hotel ownership under corporate conglomerates transformed management strategies. Decisions about renovation investments, pricing models, and labor contracts increasingly reflected shareholder interests rather than local community priorities. Corporate acquisitions and mergers altered ownership structures at regular intervals during the late 20th century. Parent companies sought to integrate the hotel into broader brand portfolios, leveraging its historical prestige for global marketing advantage. These strategies aimed to maximize occupancy rates, increase convention bookings, and generate loyalty among business travelers through rewards programs and standardized service frameworks. Local critics argued that corporate consolidation diminished historical authenticity by subordinating heritage value to economic calculation. Meanwhile, preservationists advocated for maintaining architectural integrity and emphasizing the site's connection to San Francisco's past. The emergence of historic preservation movements during this period influenced decision-making around renovations and land use. Municipal governments implemented regulatory frameworks to protect landmarks and regulate modifications. The hotel's physical structure, interior ornamentation, and visual character became subject to preservation standards intended to balance commercial adaptation with historical continuity. This regulatory environment reflected evolving public attitudes toward architectural heritage, acknowledging that urban modernization could coexist with preservation when guided by thoughtful planning. Yet preservation efforts generated debate over whose memories and histories were prioritized. The dominant narrative celebrated the achievements of industrial magnates and business leaders, obscuring experiences of laborers, domestic workers, and marginalized groups whose contributions sustained the site's operations. These tensions surfaced in academic scholarship and public discourse, exploring power dynamics embedded in historical narratives and built environments. The Mark Hopkins Hotel thus became both an object of preservation and a contested symbol of selective memory. Architectural modifications enacted during the late 20th century illustrated negotiation between past and present. Renovations introduced new materials and technologies while retaining decorative elements from earlier periods. Designers preserved ballrooms, lounges, lobbies, and guest rooms associated with historical significance, refurbishing surfaces and fixtures to reflect their original appearance. Simultaneously, developers expanded service areas, modernized utilities, and reconfigured spaces to meet accessibility standards. These interventions reflected recognition that historical structures could remain commercially viable through adaptive reuse, grounded in respect for architectural legacy. During this era, the hotel also acquired cultural capital by hosting celebrities, political leaders, and high-profile events featured in national media coverage. The site gained a reputation as a nexus for influence and social prestige. The top of the Mark Lounge, with its panoramic views, became associated with romantic mythology and celebrated urban vistas. Popular culture references further cemented the hotel's iconic status. Yet the symbolic prominence of the hotel also generated heightened expectations for seismic preparedness following major earthquakes in California throughout the 20th century. Retrofitting initiatives expanded to incorporate base isolation technologies, structural dampers, and reinforced core systems. Engineers collaborated with preservation specialists to ensure that safety improvements would not compromise historical features. These interventions demonstrated evolving engineering capability and recognition of seismic risk as an enduring concern. By the late 20th century, San Francisco's economy had diversified further, incorporating technology, finance, and tourism as primary drivers. The Mark Hopkins Hotel continued to operate within this changing context, recalibrating its role in relation to emerging forms of capital accumulation. Its longevity depended on the ability to navigate fluctuating markets, preserve historic value, and maintain relevance in the global hospitality industry. Beneath these economic developments remained unresolved historical questions concerning the origins of the site and the legacies of industrial capitalism. The transformation from private mansion to corporate hotel illustrated broader shifts in American social organization, from aristocratic wealth concentrated in private estates to corporate power manifested through public institutions. Yet the symbolic foundation of the hotel rested upon the memory of Mark Hopkins and the Gilded Age industrial elite, whose actions shaped economic infrastructure and urban development patterns. As the 20th century drew to a close, these historical legacies became subjects of renewed scrutiny in academic and public discourse. Scholars interrogated the narratives surrounding wealth accumulation, infrastructure development, and urban inequality. The Hopkins Mansion and its hotel successor became case studies for examining the intersections of memory, commodification, and architectural heritage in modern urban environments. The fifth chapter of the story ends at this threshold of historical self-reflection. The Mark Hopkins Hotel, still occupying its place atop Nob Hill, had survived disaster, economic transformation, and cultural upheaval. Its continued existence represented both resilience and the capacity of capital to reconfigure itself through architectural form. The next installment will examine the contemporary period, addressing the pressures of globalization, shifting urban economies, preservation ethics, and new vulnerabilities associated with climate change and seismic uncertainty. At the turn of the 21st century, when the Mark Hopkins Hotel entered a period defined by globalization, shifting urban economies, heightened seismic awareness, and intensifying debates surrounding preservation, equity, and the commodification of history, San Francisco experienced profound social and economic transformation during this era. The city became a hub of technological innovation, venture capital, and global tourism. Property values escalated rapidly, and the urban core underwent redevelopment processes that reshaped neighborhoods and intensified socioeconomic stratification. The Mark Hopkins Hotel remained a prominent feature atop Nob Hill, but the context surrounding it fundamentally changed. The hotel's position within an evolving global hospitality market required continuous adaptation. Ownership structures became increasingly complex, involving multinational corporations and investment groups managing portfolios across international cities. Decision-making shifted further from local stakeholders to global financiers, whose strategies prioritized profitability through standardization, efficiency, and brand alignment. Corporate restructuring drove changes in staffing, service models, and marketing campaigns. Labor unions continued negotiation efforts to secure protections for workers amid pressures to reduce costs. These negotiations reflected sustained tensions within the hospitality industry between financial imperatives and labor rights. Meanwhile, preservationists confronted new challenges. Climate change and environmental degradation necessitated reevaluation of material conservation practices, building maintenance protocols, and energy systems. Rising energy costs and sustainability standards prompted retrofits aimed at improving insulation, HVAC efficiency, and water conservation. Engineers navigated the tension between environmental upgrades and preservation ethics that demanded minimal alteration to historic fabric. Preservation frameworks adopted increasingly nuanced approaches, recognizing that survival of historic buildings depended upon incorporating modern technologies to mitigate environmental impacts. The hotel thus became a case study in reconciling sustainability with historical integrity. At the same time, seismic vulnerability persisted as a central concern. Advances in geotechnical engineering, seismic monitoring, and structural analysis generated new knowledge about earthquake risk in dense urban areas. Revised building codes required further strengthening of existing structures. Retrofitting efforts integrated technologies such as viscous dampers, moment-resisting frames, and base isolation foundations. Work was conducted in phases to minimize disruption to guests while advancing structural resilience. Engineers documented existing conditions thoroughly before intervention, generating archives of drawings, photographs, and material analyses that enhanced scholarly understanding of historical construction methods. The Mark Hopkins Hotel also became a focal point for academic discourse surrounding memory, heritage, and urban identity. Scholars analyzed representations of Nob Hill in literature, film, and tourism marketing materials, noting patterns of romanticization and selective memory that foregrounded glamour while marginalizing histories of labor, migration, and inequality. The tension between public fascination with luxury and critical inquiry into the social foundations of wealth persisted throughout the early 21st century. Tourism expanded significantly during this period. International travelers increasingly shaped hotel occupancy patterns, drawn to San Francisco as a destination for cultural tourism, conferences, and leisure travel. The Mark Hopkins marketed itself globally through partnerships with travel agencies, promotional campaigns, and participation in international tourism forums. Marketing narratives emphasized panoramic views, historical significance, and proximity to landmarks such as Chinatown, Union Square, and the financial district. Yet these narratives coexisted with critique. Scholars of tourism studies argued that heritage commodification transformed cultural memory into consumable experience, reducing complex histories into simplified aesthetic appeal. The Mark Hopkins, once a site of private wealth and political influence, now functioned as a commercial symbol whose meaning was shaped by market circulation rather than lived experience of the mansion that preceded it. Public history initiatives attempted to address gaps in collective memory. Exhibits, lectures, and archival projects highlighted the history of the mansion and its destruction in the 1906 earthquake and fire. Preservation organizations developed interpretive materials acknowledging the broader context of railroad expansion, labor exploitation, and capitalist accumulation that enabled the mansion's construction. Such initiatives attempted to deepen public understanding beyond nostalgic celebration of architectural grandeur. The digital revolution generated new interactions between heritage and technology. Virtual tour, digitized archives, and interactive displays allowed remote audiences to access historical materials. These projects expanded the reach of public history while raising questions about authenticity and the role of digital mediation in shaping memory. Meanwhile, the hotel itself underwent technological modernization. Digital reservation systems, electronic key cards, surveillance systems, and network infrastructure transformed hotel administration. Data analytics influenced pricing strategies, occupancy projections, and marketing algorithms. These developments integrated the hotel into digital networks that spanned global financial and travel sectors. Yet technological integration also heightened vulnerabilities associated with cybersecurity and data privacy. Corporate decisions about data management, surveillance, and guest information reflected shifting ethical and legal concerns. Throughout this era, Nob Hill evolved in response to global capital flows, tourism demand, and demographic change. Rising property values and redevelopment pressures reshaped residential patterns, accelerating displacement of lower-income residents from surrounding neighborhoods. Critics argued that luxury hotels contributed to gentrification and exacerbated inequality by signaling investment priorities that favored tourism over long-term affordable housing. Municipal governments debated policies to mitigate displacement and regulate land use. Proposals included zoning restrictions, affordable housing requirements, and taxation reforms targeting tourism and commercial development. The Mark Hopkins Hotel became implicated indirectly in these debates by virtue of its symbolic position within the city's political economy. As discourse intensified around equity, resilience, and sustainability, the hotel's identity evolved once again. Its historical significance invited scrutiny regarding responsibility to community and heritage stewardship. Discussions emerged within preservation and planning circles about whether historic hotels should contribute more directly to public benefit through educational programs, community partnerships, and inclusive interpretation strategies. Concurrently, the hotel experienced fluctuating occupancy patterns influenced by global crises. Economic recessions, geopolitical instability, and health emergencies created volatility in international travel. The early 21st century witnessed events that disrupted tourism flows, including the financial crisis of 2008 and public health crises in subsequent decades. These disruptions exposed the vulnerability of tourism-dependent economies and placed strain on hospitality institutions. The Mark Hopkins Hotel implemented cost containment strategies and operational adjustments, including reduced staffing, modified service delivery, and flexible pricing policies. These measures underscored dependence on global travel networks and revealed underlying fragility within seemingly stable institutions. Yet the hotel also served as a refuge during certain crises, providing temporary lodging for displaced residents, emergency personnel, and government officials. Such cases illustrated the adaptive capacity of hospitality infrastructure during emergencies. Meanwhile, interest in historical research and cultural memory deepened as anniversaries of the 1906 earthquake approached. Commemorative events revived public awareness of the Hopkins Mansion's destruction. Scholars revisited archival records and analyzed previously overlooked sources documenting the mansion's architectural details, social life, and symbolic significance. The hotel's interpretive programs incorporated more rigorous historical context, acknowledging complexities of wealth concentration, labor exploitation, and displacement associated with the mansion era. Public education initiatives sought to democratize access to historical narratives and expand recognition of actors previously marginalized in dominant accounts, including domestic laborers, immigrant workers, and indigenous communities affected by railroad expansion. These efforts reflected a broader movement toward inclusive historiography that interrogated power dynamics embedded in material culture and built environments. Yet such initiatives coexisted with commercial imperatives, promoting romanticized imagery of historic elegance. Advertising campaigns continued to deploy nostalgic aesthetics that emphasized timeless luxury and panoramic vistas. The coexistence of critical public history and commercial nostalgia demonstrated persistent tensions between heritage and commodification. As urban planners confronted climate change, concerns regarding sea level rise, water scarcity, and extreme weather intensified. Although Nob Hill sat above projected flood zones, infrastructure supporting the hotel remained vulnerable to disruptions affecting power grids, water systems, and transportation networks. Resilience planning increasingly emphasized regional interdependencies linking hotels, transit systems, emergency services, and utilities. Engineers revised projections for seismic risk in light of new geophysical models. Policy debates centered on funding requirements for retrofitting aging structures, insurance limitations, and the distribution of risk between private owners, insurers, and public agencies. The Mark Hopkins Hotel became a reference point within broader discussions concerning the preservation and resilience of historic structures in seismic regions. Scholars and policymakers argued that protecting architectural heritage required proactive planning, grounded in scientific research and collective responsibility. Through the early 21st century, the site continued to symbolize layered histories: industrial wealth, urban disaster, reconstruction, corporate evolution, cultural memory, and vulnerability to natural forces. It represented continuity within a city defined by instability and transformation. Yet beneath continuity lay unresolved contradictions concerning equity, heritage stewardship, and responsible adaptation to uncertain futures. The sixth chapter of this narrative concludes with the Mark Hopkins Hotel positioned at a crossroads. Its past remained embedded in public consciousness, while its future depended on forces extending beyond local control. Global tourism markets, economic volatility, environmental risk, and debates over collective memory would shape the next phase of the site's evolution. The seventh installment will explore accelerating pressures associated with digital globalization, sustainability ethics, and seismic and climate models predicting heightened risk. It will examine how the site negotiates competing demands of preservation, profit, and safety within increasingly volatile conditions. In the decades when accelerating digital globalization, intensifying seismic research, and advancing climate projections converged to reshape expectations for the future of the Mark Hopkins site. It was in these years that city planners, engineers, insurers, corporate owners, and preservation advocates increasingly acknowledged that historic structures perched on the unstable ridge of San Francisco faced unprecedented pressures. While the early decades of the century had already witnessed seismic retrofits, sustainability upgrades, and modernization of building systems, the next phase confronted more fundamental questions about whether continued habitation of such sites remained viable under intensifying risk conditions. Scientific models refined projections for major seismic events along the San Andreas and Hayward faults, incorporating new GPS measurements of crustal deformation, probabilistic rupture scenarios, and updated ground motion simulations. These models suggested the potential for long-period ground shaking, capable of inflicting significant damage on high-rise structures across the urban core, including those resting atop bedrock ridges such as Nob Hill. Structural engineers and geophysicists collaborated to evaluate vulnerabilities within older high-rise hotels, whose foundational systems predated contemporary seismic design methodologies. Assessments considered building mass distribution, torsional response, column integrity, and dynamic soul structure interaction. Engineers debated whether additional retrofits could sufficiently mitigate risk, or whether at some threshold, reinforcing aging structures became economically and technically untenable. Meanwhile, climate research projected increasing frequencies of extreme heat events, wildfire smoke incursions, and power disruptions. Although sea level rise minimally threatened the elevated bluff where the hotel stood, interdependent infrastructure systems remained vulnerable. Power grid instability posed risks to fire suppression systems, water pumps, and digital building controls. Emergency planning frameworks increasingly emphasized redundancy, microgrid capability, and on-site energy storage. Corporate owners evaluated cost-benefit projections for incorporating renewable energy systems, battery storage, and advanced air filtration units capable of mitigating particulate intrusion during wildfire seasons. These considerations intersected with intensifying global tourism volatility. Digital platforms amplified real-time fluctuations in demand driven by social media, economic instability, public health crises, and geopolitical tensions. Hotels became integrated nodes in a dynamic network of predictive analytics, automated pricing algorithms, and AI-driven revenue management systems. The Mark Hopkins adapted to these systems to remain competitive in global booking platforms. However, reliance upon algorithmic governance raised questions concerning labor conditions, guest privacy, and the erosion of traditional hospitality practices. Critics argued that automation and data-driven management models displaced personalized service, intensified workplace surveillance, and undermined long-standing professional roles within hotel labor hierarchies. Labor unions challenged algorithmic scheduling practices perceived to reduce wages and destabilize job security. These conflicts paralleled broader national debates concerning automation, data ownership, and labor rights. Preservation advocates continued developing rigorous interpretive frameworks that acknowledged intertwined histories of infrastructure, risk, capital accumulation, and labor exploitation. They argued that preserving historic buildings necessitated confronting ethical questions concerning long-term stewardship responsibilities and obligations to future generations. Meanwhile, San Francisco confronted escalating housing insecurity and displacement. Municipal debates considered whether luxury hotels occupying prime land parcels should be subject to increased taxation or regulation aimed at mitigating inequity. Some policy proposals explored adaptive reuse incentives, encouraging partial conversion of historic hotels into mixed-income residential units, though such proposals faced steep economic and regulatory hurdles. The Mark Hopkins entered these debates symbolically rather than as an immediate candidate for conversion. Its presence provoked questions concerning the appropriate role of iconic historic structures in urban environments grappling with affordability crises. Tourism industry advocates opposed measures perceived to threaten economic viability. Preservationists argued that dismantling historic interiors risked irreversible loss of cultural heritage. Housing advocates countered that symbolic attachments to architectural prestige should not outweigh human needs. The hotel thus became a focal point for unresolved tensions between past and future, public benefit and private ownership, symbolic identity and material necessity. Technological evolution continued reshaping experiential dimensions of heritage interpretation. VR and AR platforms enabled immersive reconstructions of the original Hopkins Mansion, integrating 3D modeling derived from surviving photographs, architectural plans, and written descriptions. Visitors could inhabit simulated domestic interiors, explore vanished landscapes, and observe virtual dramatizations of the mansion during the years preceding the 1906 disaster. These reconstructions blurred boundaries between memory, simulation, and education. Philosophers and media theorists interrogated implications of digital heritage, whether simulation enhanced understanding or risked supplanting critical engagement with mediated spectacle. Public perception increasingly conflated virtual reconstruction with historical authenticity. Scholars emphasized the necessity of transparent interpretive framing to distinguish archival evidence from speculative reconstruction. Parallel technologies transformed building operations. Predictive maintenance systems monitored sensors embedded throughout structural components, HVAC systems, elevators, and plumbing networks. AI-driven models predicted mechanical failures based on vibration patterns, temperature anomalies, and usage trends. These systems extended equipment lifespan and reduced downtime, but generated massive datasets requiring secure storage and encryption protocols. Cybersecurity threats emerged as a critical risk category. Hospitality institutions represented attractive targets due to extensive repositories of guest data, payment information, and personal identifiers. Security breaches in hotels worldwide heightened awareness of vulnerabilities. Corporate owners implemented encryption systems, intruder detection algorithms, and staff training programs. Nevertheless, persistent risk underscored dependencies upon global data networks and digital governance systems. As infrastructure modernization advanced, debates concerning seismic resilience intensified. Engineers proposed retrofitting strategies involving supplemental damping systems, fiber-reinforced polymer wraps for columns, tuned mass dampers installed near rooftop mechanical systems, and integration of real-time structural health monitoring capable of transmitting diagnostic signals during earthquake events. These retrofits carried significant cost and required phased implementation to minimize operational disruption. Insurance providers adjusted underwriting standards to reflect updated risk projections, increasing premiums and requiring proof of advanced seismic mitigation measures. Corporate owners calculated financial feasibility of further retrofitting against projected returns from continued operation of a luxury heritage hotel. Some analysts speculated that market forces might, in time, render preservation economically non-viable, prompting sale, redevelopment, or adaptive reuse. Preservationists countered that heritage value extended beyond market valuation. Municipal officials considered policy mechanisms to incentivize long-term preservation, including tax credits or grant subsidies conditioned on seismic resilience and public interpretation commitments. Meanwhile, academic researchers expanded interdisciplinary analyses integrating seismology, labor history, urban planning, tourism economics, and cultural memory. They argued that the Mark Hopkins site exemplified the challenges faced by historic structures operating within multi-scalar, multi-systemic risk environments. Their work emphasized how heritage preservation could not be separated from questions of environmental sustainability, seismic preparedness, economic justice, and ethical stewardship. Public consciousness surrounding seismic risk heightened following new regional earthquakes. Media coverage invoked historical memory of 1906 and 1989, generating renewed calls for comprehensive retrofitting across vulnerable structures. Debates intensified concerning prioritization frameworks, funding mechanisms, and legal liability in the event of catastrophic failure. Increasingly, preservation emerged as a practice inseparable from anticipation of disaster. The Mark Hopkins Hotel embodied both continuity and precariousness, suspended between historical legacy and uncertain future. The concluding installment will examine scenarios confronting the site in the period when probabilistic risk models, ethical debates, economic pressures, and evolving notions of heritage converged to shape decisions regarding preservation, adaptation, or potential transformation. The final part of this video examines the period when probabilistic risk models, intensifying climate projections, insurance volatility, ethical stewardship debates, and shifting economic structures forced a reckoning about the long-term future of the Mark Hopkins site. The decades leading to this culminating phase witnessed mounting recognition that preservation of historic high-rise hotels on seismically active ground required strategies extending beyond standard retrofits, aesthetic conservation, or commercial reinvestment. The concern no longer centered solely on reinforcing aging structural systems. Instead, stakeholders confronted an existential question: whether maintaining a vulnerable historic structure atop a ridge surrounded by dense urban fabric constituted responsible governance, in light of scientific projections, anticipating major seismic rupture within a probabilistically defined time horizon. Engineers published updated, hazard analyses integrating refined stress accumulation measurements, high-resolution geologic mapping of fault traces, and simulations accounting for ridge topographic amplification effects. These analyses projected strong ground motions at frequencies capable of inducing resonance in mid-20th century steel frame structures, leading to heightened torsional response risks. Structural health monitoring systems installed throughout the hotel transmitted real-time data on drift patterns, vibration signatures, and structural damping capacity. These data informed predictive algorithms capable of estimating probable damage states for various seismic scenarios. Reports circulated among municipal officials, insurers, and corporate owners outlining projected loss estimates, downtime durations, potential casualties in worst-case events, and cascading infrastructure failures likely to accompany severe seismic rupture. Insurance markets responded by reclassifying risk categories for historic high-rise hotels located near fault zones. Premiums increased sharply, deductibles rose, and underwriting standards required evidence of advanced mitigating technologies. Some insurers signaled eventual withdrawal from underwriting high-risk heritage structures, absent major retrofitting or partial decommissioning. Financial analyses revealed asymmetry between escalating insurance costs and projected revenue streams, prompting corporate owners to evaluate long-term asset viability. Preservation advocates intensified arguments concerning cultural responsibility. Scholars contended that dismantling or significantly altering structures, such as the Mark Hopkins, risked erasing tangible links to historical memory, architectural heritage, and collective identity. Urban historians argued that historic buildings constituted intellectual and emotional infrastructure for cities facing destabilizing conditions. They insisted that abandonment of preservation efforts reflected capitulation to short-term financial calculus over intergenerational stewardship. Simultaneously, planners articulated counterarguments grounded in ethics of risk mitigation and public safety. They maintained that knowingly preserving vulnerable structures in high-risk zones imposed unacceptable burdens upon emergency response systems, insurance pools, and future residents. Some contended that moral responsibility required managed decommissioning or adaptive reuse approaches, reducing occupancy densities, while retaining architectural elements for interpretive purposes. Municipal agencies convened public hearings to solicit expert testimony across disciplines including seismology, structural engineering, risk modeling, heritage preservation, tourism economics, and social justice. Testimonies documented the complex entanglement of cultural, economic, technological, and geological forces shaping decisions. Community advocates emphasized that civic resources required for preservation, retrofits diverted funding from affordable housing, infrastructure maintenance, and disaster preparedness for vulnerable populations residing in structurally deficient buildings across the region. Preservationists countered that failure to protect historic structures constituted a loss of irreplaceable knowledge embedded within material fabric. Public debate highlighted unresolved tensions concerning collective memory, distributive justice, and intergenerational responsibility. Emerging climate projections compounded seismic concerns. Although the ridge remained above projected inundation scenarios, dependencies upon regional infrastructure systems exposed vulnerabilities to cascading disruptions arising from wildfire-induced power outages, heat waves stressing electrical grids, and air quality emergencies requiring sealed filtration systems. Engineers proposed integrating microgrid-capable energy systems, high-efficiency particulate filtration, and passive thermal regulation through envelope enhancements. These interventions required significant capital investment and structural modification, raising further questions about feasibility given seismic cost projections. Corporate ownership structures shifted as multinational investment groups divested from high-risk hospitality assets. Prospective buyers evaluated redevelopment opportunities involving partial demolition, adaptive reuse, or selective preservation of historically significant architectural elements, combined with new seismic-resilient construction. Proposals ranged from conversion to mixed-use developments incorporating cultural spaces, residential units, and commercial amenities to complete decommissioning accompanied by archival preservation and digital commemoration. Preservationists contested redevelopment proposals perceived to commodify historical elements while erasing lived architectural context. Developers argued that hybrid preservation models could reconcile heritage values with contemporary safety and economic requirements. Municipal planning agencies commissioned feasibility studies to evaluate adaptive reuse scenarios, including integration of seismic isolation platforms beneath retained structures, incorporation of energy-positive building systems, and reconfiguration of interior spaces to reduce structural load demands. Results indicated technical feasibility at significant cost. Analysts highlighted financial uncertainties arising from insurance conditions, global tourism volatility, and long-term maintenance requirements for advanced mitigation systems. Debate shifted from technical feasibility to ethical valuation, whether preserving physical material justified economic expenditure in a city confronting inequality, displacement, and infrastructure fragility. Heritage theorists argued that preservation required reframing as long-term investment in social cohesion and intergenerational continuity, rather than discretionary consumption for elite nostalgia or tourism marketing. They insisted that adaptive reuse promoting community engagement could integrate heritage into resilient urban futures. The Mark Hopkins site became a focal case within a broader national discourse, confronting how to preserve heritage responsibly amid accelerating planetary instability. Conferences convened interdisciplinary scholars, engineers, and policymakers to examine frameworks for evaluating heritage preservation under probabilistic risk conditions. Papers argued that risk-based decision frameworks must incorporate cultural valuation metrics alongside probabilistic loss estimates. Others contended that physical preservation under extreme risk contradicted precautionary ethics and proposed interpretive preservation through digital reconstruction, archival stewardship, and material sampling, rather than maintaining vulnerable structures at scale. Meanwhile, urban economic conditions shifted. Automation intensified restructuring across the hospitality sector, reducing labor demand for traditional service roles. Labor unions advocated retraining programs and income protections. Tourism demand fluctuated due to geopolitical instability and changing travel behavior influenced by carbon accountability and energy cost escalation. Some travelers prioritized low-carbon itineraries and avoided long-haul travel, reducing occupancy in destination cities dependent on international tourism. These forces contributed to declining profitability for historic luxury hotels, requiring intensive maintenance and seismic retrofitting. As economic pressures intensified, corporate owners initiated formal evaluation processes considering divestment. Redevelopment, or decommissioning. Regulatory agencies required comprehensive environmental impact reports analyzing effects on heritage values, embodied carbon emissions, waste streams, traffic, and infrastructure load. Preservation organizations mobilized archival projects to document the hotel thoroughly through high-resolution 3D scans, oral histories, and cataloging of surviving architectural elements traced to the vanished Hopkins Mansion's material lineage. These efforts positioned archival preservation as essential safeguard against potential physical loss. After prolonged debate, the decision emerged not as singular event, but as gradual convergence of actuarial risk assessments, insurance market withdrawal, labor restructuring, climatic instability projections, and cultural valuation reconsiderations. Public sentiment evolved toward acceptance that physical occupation of the historic structure posed unacceptable long-term risk and economic burden. The negotiated resolution involved phased decommissioning of hotel operations, accompanied by comprehensive documentation, removal and conservation of architecturally significant interior components, and development of a seismic isolation-supported interpretive center, constructed adjacent to the preserved fragment representing core historical fabric integrated within a new resilient structure. Excavated structural sections were retained as educational exhibits illustrating historical construction methods, seismic vulnerabilities, and evolution of urban risk management. Interpretive programming emphasized intertwined histories of industrial wealth, colonial extraction linked to railroad expansion, immigrant labor, seismic disaster reconstruction, luxury tourism, automation, climate instability, and ethical stewardship. The preserved fragment and adjacent interpretive center constituted a new form of heritage infrastructure, acknowledging vulnerability and discontinuity, rather than romanticizing permanence. Visitors encountered material testimony to the impossibility of static preservation under escalating planetary volatility. The decommissioning process revealed embedded assumptions about permanence, ownership, and cultural authority underpinning traditional preservation discourse. Scholars framed the transformation as paradigm shift toward dynamic heritage, emphasizing resilience, adaptation, and ethical accountability, rather than aesthetic conservation alone. The Mark Hopkins narrative became case study, demonstrating that heritage preservation must engage with probabilistic risk modeling, sustainability, equity, and future generational welfare. The legacy of the Mark Hopkins Mansion and its successors culminated not in continued occupation of vulnerable architecture, but in acknowledgement of impermanence, collective responsibility, and evolving ethical frameworks for confronting uncertain futures. The site's significance persisted through transformed material presence, critical interpretation, and institutional memory, grounded in recognition that heritage stewardship requires confronting risk, inequality, and interdependence, rather than preserving symbols detached from contemporary realities.